I'm saying, so your plan for this election was to come to women and say, forget the economy, forget immigration. Roe v. Wade was overturned. It's now a states' right issue as opposed to a federal issue. You thought that was going to be enough? You thought it was going to be enough for you to look at black men and say to black men, you're misogynistic and chauvinistic, and that's the reason why you're not voting for Kamala Harris? You thought it was going to be enough for the Latinos to bring up immigration when you're not paying attention enough that the Cubans think different than the Dominicans, and the Dominicans and the Cubans think different than the Colombians, and they think different than the Venezuelans and the Guatemalans and the Puerto Ricans and the Mexicans, etc., etc. A lot of these Latinos in America want.
Recently, Stephen A. Smith stopped by Bill Maher's Club Random podcast, and sparks definitely flew. The two held nothing back as they tore into the Democratic Party for what they described as an unhealthy obsession with woke politics and self-destructive policies that have driven the party straight into the ground. Stephen A. didn't hesitate to call out the DNC for putting Kamala Harris front and center, calling it a major mistake. Meanwhile, Maher, a lifelong liberal, spoke like a man disillusioned by the very party he once proudly defended. This conversation was pure fire from start to finish, so buckle up, because it's one you don't want to miss.
Thing to Friday is that I'm pissed at the Democrats because my issues, democracy, the environment, have no protectors now. Because you blew the election, I have nobody standing up for the two issues that are my issues.
Which is?
Democracy and the environment, to my two most important issues. Those are not priorities in the new administration.
Okay.
In fact, they're antagonistic to both of them. So I have no champion in Washington. They have the courts, they have the House and the Senate, and you totally left me unguarded.
Maher is furious with the DNC for losing the election and, in his view, sacrificing democracy. I understand where his frustration comes from. He's watching his own party crumble. But let's be real, his anger feels misplaced. What democracy is he talking about exactly? Trump didn't refuse to leave office after 2016. He stepped aside when his term ended. If Maher is referring to the lawsuits against certain media outlets, that's an entirely different issue. Shows like 60 Minutes practically acted as Kamala Harris's PR team, editing interviews to make her appear polished and articulate. So yes, Trump had every right to push back. And as for Colbert and Kimmel, come on, what did Maher expect? They turned their late-night shows into endless Trump-bashing sessions. You can't suddenly cry threat to democracy when accountability finally comes knocking at your favorite liberal door. That's where my issue lies.
Issue, generally speaking. We can talk to the economy, immigration, crime in the streets, blah, blah, blah. Here's my ultimate issue. The arrogance of the Democratic Party.
I'm saying the same thing.
Arrogance of we're saying the same thing in two different ways. The arrogance of the second Democratic Party. So Biden doesn't decide to run for re-election. Use grief the skid so he doesn't have to go through a primary. June 27th, he shows up and he embarrasses himself. And it positions naturally for the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, to ultimately ascend and become the Democratic nominee. But the last time we saw her in the primary, she couldn't make it to Iowa. Did you really think that was going?
Unlike Maher, Stephen A. Smith isn't wallowing in betrayal. He saw the Democrats' downfall coming from a mile away. To him, this wasn't some shocking collapse. It was a slow-motion train wreck everyone chose to ignore. Stephen believes Biden should have stepped aside long before things got this bad. The warning signs were glaring: plummeting approval ratings, fading enthusiasm, and a party too afraid to confront reality. Instead of opening the field for a genuine primary and allowing voters to choose a strong, capable leader, the DNC handed the nomination to Kamala Harris as if it were her birthright. No competition, no debate, no fresh ideas, just blind loyalty to a candidate who never managed to inspire the base. Stephen's message was brutally clear. This wasn't betrayal, it was political negligence. The Democrats didn't lose because of fate. They lost because they refused to learn.
So your plan for this election was to come to women and say, Forget the economy. Forget immigration. Roe v. Wade was overturned. It's now a states' right issue as opposed to a federal issue. You thought that was going to be enough? You thought it was going to be enough for you to look at black men and say to black men, you're misogynistic and chauvinistic, and that's the reason why you're not voting for Kamala Harris? You thought it was going to be enough for the Latinos to bring up immigration when you're not paying attention enough that the Cubans think different than the Dominicans, and the Dominicans and the Cubans think different than the Colombians, and they think different than the Venezuelans and the Guatemalans and the Puerto Ricans and the Mexicans, etc., etc. A lot of these Latinos in America want the border.
Stephen A. Smith didn't stop there. He went straight after another glaring hypocrisy in the DNC's so-called fight for immigrants. He reminded everyone that during Barack Obama's presidency, deportations reached an all-time high. Obama recognized the national security risks tied to unchecked illegal immigration and took action. Yet, the same Democrats who once praised him for it completely lost their minds when ICE under Trump began enforcing the very same laws. Stephen pointed out how the left went from defending border security to calling for the abolition of ICE practically overnight, all for the sake of political theater. It wasn't about compassion, he argued, but about optics and votes. The hypocrisy was stunning. When Obama did it, it was called responsible leadership. When Trump did it, it was labeled cruelty. Stephen A. made his point crystal clear. The DNC's stance on immigration has nothing to do with morality or safety. It's about power and pretending to care when the cameras are rolling.
California. You were a district attorney here. You were a state attorney general here. You were a senator representing here. And you didn't know that the Latinos were going to say, yo, we don't like open borders. You didn't know that?
Yeah,
And so I'm looking at it and I'm saying all of these things are going on. All of these things are going on. And your argument essentially was, you didn't say it, but this is essentially your argument. It's her turn.
Now, plenty of Democrats will argue otherwise, but facts don't care about feelings. The previous administration's open border approach allowed millions to cross into the country illegally, and that wasn't compassion, it was chaos disguised as empathy. By refusing to enforce immigration laws and dismantling critical border protections, they effectively opened the floodgates. Communities along the southern border were overwhelmed, law enforcement was stretched to the limit, and the entire system began to collapse under the weight of failed leadership. This wasn't an accident, it was policy by design. And now, President Trump is left to deal with the aftermath. The border crisis, overcrowded shelters, and the surge in human trafficking all trace back to decisions made by leaders who prioritized political virtue, signaling over national security. Stephen A. Smith wasn't exaggerating. He was exposing an uncomfortable truth. The Democrats created a crisis they now pretend doesn't exist.